Aloha and welcome to VOSR International, the voice of shortwave radio. I'm your host, Wavecrest Guy. This broadcast is being transmitted by WRMI, Radio Miami International, in Okeechobee, Florida, on both 9455 and 15770 kilohertz. This broadcast is also being transmitted by shortwave radio in Lower Saxony, Germany, on 3975 kilohertz.
And that's right, you're tuned to VOSR International, the voice of shortwave radio. And hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in wherever you are, whether you're listening on WRMI or Shortwave Radio Gold in Germany. I am Liam Spencer in Berthoud, Colorado, USA, filling in this week for Jeff. So I want to start off this first segment talking about a little bit of shortwave radio history. For anybody who's tuned the shortwave radio bands in the 70s and 80s in the utility side of things, might remember the AT&T High Seas service stations WOO in Ocean Gate, New Jersey, WOM in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and KMI in Dixon, California, along with their separate receiver sites. These three stations, back in the early 1930s up to November of 1999, created AT&T's High Seas service over the shortwave bands. So these stations were, well, before the days of satellite communication, this was how it was done over the shortwaves, was by taking a call from a ship and then picking up the specific antenna, or picking up wherever the location was, selecting the best antenna, and then patching their signal into the telephone network. And so WOO covered all of like the Atlantic, the northern Atlantic area. WOM, carried transmissions from the Caribbean and the southern Atlantic, and then KMI covered the entire Pacific area. And so these stations, I feel like, are quite interesting because if you look online at them, they have these huge rhombic antennas and a lot of space. A lot of them have been dismantled now, but it's quite interesting. And a lot of other countries had these high seas service stations for various areas. I know there was one operated by the British Telecom. There was one in Moscow. All sorts of countries, probably every country might have had one. So here's a brief summary from Wikipedia on what these stations had specifically. Each high seas station maintained a radio watch on multiple HF radio channels on multiple marine radio bands. Depending on propagation and distance, the ship's radio officer would select a likely band and call on a channel for the high seas service station listening on that available frequency. Then the high seas radio technician would ask for the location of the ship and select the antenna orientated in the best direction, or advise a better frequency or even a better located station to call. Many of the high seas antennas were fixed rhombics, and the coverage patterns were provided by AT&T to subscribers. While many of the marine HF channels are full duplex, few ships had the radio and antenna capability for duplex operation. Users had to learn to say over when done talking, and the shipboard radio man would key the transmitter, since the operator and the whole world could listen in and nothing was private in the conversation. And I thought that was something quite interesting. You're sitting there on your HF radio and you're listening to these telephone calls just as second nature, because it's HF radio. It's open. There's no encryption on it. It's purely analog. There's no like digital encryption or whatever in the system. And I believe I've heard from somebody who listened to these stations in the 1980s, there's some funny stories that they were talking about when it came to what they had heard on the various stations. And it seems to me that they'd play a test transmission for circuit adjustment purposes. Now, I don't know specifically what that means, but I could assume, since most of these transmissions were usually like double sideband or single sideband, this was to help, this looped message would help people on ships tune in more precisely the single sideband or the double sideband before giving a call. The reason why the receiving and transmitting locations were separate is due to the fact that they wanted to keep them a little bit spaced, because I believe in those early days, if one was transmitting, it was a lot harder to hear what they were actually saying, the ship. And so those people on land decided, okay, it's better to stretch them out so that way we can hear the ship and also hear what the other station is transmitting. And another thing I should mention is the price of these calls are absolutely outrageous. There's not a specific price on the Wikipedia page, but I found a newspaper article from 1991, and one of the technicians there was already saying that calls were $5 per minute. But the Wikipedia article also states plus long distance. Now, if that's true, even for 1991, $5 per minute plus long distance, that sounds like a lot of money. And also on that newspaper article, a lot of the people, at least in the 90s, early 90s, starting to communicate only on those specific bands were ships, oil tankers, who were wanting to call their boss or whoever, give the current crude oil price, and basically be like, should I speed up or slow down, according to that news article. Something also interesting on that news article is the technicians there were already starting to get an understanding that this service was going to fade out, which is quite interesting because it would eventually fade out in 1999, and that AT&T would close all 3 stations, and eventually all the antennas would be dismantled and all sorts of that. But the fact that even then they were already talking about this system being faded out is quite an interesting matter, I think, that they knew their time was coming. But I wondered if maybe they weren't expecting it to last as long as it did throughout the 90s. And something is certainly interesting with Dixon, California, the Dixon, California transmitter KMI, especially on the fact that it wasn't too far away from the antennas are still there, still standing Voice of America Dixon, California relay station, which closed, I believe, in the mid-'80s, one of the first 3 World War II built era transmitting facilities on shortwave for Voice of America in the U.S., Bethany, Delano, and Dixon, and that was the first one to close down. But Dixon, KMI in Dixon also relayed Voice of America during those World War years before Voice of America built their relay station, or while it was currently being built, or whatever. And so we're going to get to some recordings now. I'm going to play you some of those loops that people would often hear from the station. These are from the mid-'70s. And first we're going to give you that loop transmission for circuit adjustment purposes from WOO in Ocean Gate, New Jersey first. Then we will give you WOM, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and then KMI in Dixon, California.
This is a test transmission for circuit adjustment purposes from a station of the American Telephone and Telegraph Company. This station is located near New York City. This transmission is broadcast for circuit adjustment purposes from a station of the American Telephone and Telegraph Company. This station is located near Fort Lauderdale, Florida. This is a test transmission for receiver alignment purposes from a transmitter of the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, located at Dixon, California.
And so that's the kind of loop messages you would expect to hear, at least in the 70s, maybe in the 80s as well, if you heard one of those AT&T high-speed service stations. Now, I did find a recording from 1982. This is a very short one, and you can only hear WOM. You cannot hear the ship in this, but this is the only recording I know that isn't of some sort of looping ID of kind of how the operation would go between the ship and the AT&T high-speed service station. So this is recording from March of 1982 on one of the 8 megahertz channels of WOM. In this recording, the WOM operator asks who's calling, and then asks where their position is, and then tells them to go down to 4 megahertz because it's not going to make it on 8 megahertz. And that just shows some of the skill these technicians had when they needed to know propagation, where they were, and what frequencies would work best. So really, really skilled people on here to maximize the best connection on shortwave before getting past into the telephone network. So anyway, here is this recording of WOM from 1982.
Who is calling WOM?
Okay, I heard you say 810 plays. That's all I heard, sir. What is your position? Okay, now, sir, you're going to have to go down to 4 megahertz because it's not going to make it on 8 megahertz. Well, can you... Yeah, can you go to one of our 4 meg channels? Okay, can you go over to 417? Okay, whoever that is off Marco Island, Mississippi, web query 10 going down to 417.
So that's the kind of steps that a AT&T operator and a ship could take potentially before completing a phone call. And so in 1999, we'll jump to the closure of these. The FCC approved the closure of the stations as AT&T had cited that there are alternative sources for communication from land to ship. And so then the FCC is like, all right, go ahead, you can switch them off. And so they did that in November of 1999. And all the transmitter antennas, or not the transmitters, I believe, but all the antennas are gone from the sites. There's a lot of information on WOO. In fact, if you'll go to VOSRinternational.com and you click on one of the links, the longlines.net one specifically, there is a lot of photos from 2004 of equipment and transmitters and antennas and all sorts of that at WOO. And if you go to QSL.net, this is a operated site by somebody who used to work at WOO. There's a lot of the newspaper articles that I've mentioned and other things according to WOO, QSL cards, and some other interesting stories. If you go again to the QSL.net one and go to the related links, there's a interesting story on WOM and CRUD radio from 1991. I recommend reading that one. That's a pretty interesting one to listen to there. You know, send Jeff what you think. Send your email to VOSRINT@yahoo.com and tell Jeff, did you hear these stations? Did you hear which one? Did you ever hear any phone calls on it? Was it fun to listen to? You know, share your thoughts to Jeff at VOSRINT@yahoo.com. And check the website, VOSRinternational.com. And Jeff should have those links up for the AT&T high seas service stations. Alright, this next segment's going to be kind of on what I can hear in my area on shortwave. We're going to go through various times, various stations, when I can get them, and we're going to play like some short snippets of various recordings. I've heard a lot of stations up here in Berthoud, Colorado, and they all have very interesting propagation patterns. Some stations are very fluttery, some stations are not. Some days one station might be fluttery, and the next day the same station's not. It all varies, and I'll share my insights throughout years, the few years that I've been tuning the shortwave bands, and I also have quite a lot of recordings of various shortwave stations, so we're going to give you quick samples of those to give you an idea of what I'm kind of talking about here with certain stations. So let's start off with the US. I can hear pretty much every US shortwave radio station, with WWCR being the strongest. In fact, I could hear every single frequency on air from WWCR at one given time, or basically 24/7. Any frequency will propagate here. I'd say the most difficult station in the US to hear is KNLS, although not too difficult. I'd say that's more so for the English service, because I can hear the Chinese service as in the current season around 1700 UTC and 11780. That's pretty good. WRMI, also good signals depending on the frequency. WINB and WTWW on 9930, of course. So when we go up to Canada, I'd say CHU, which is unfortunately closing pretty recently, it can depend. Like around sunset time-ish, I can hear 14670. 3330 is not really a good frequency for me, and at night 7850 is the way to go. In the daytime, I can certainly hear 14670, although might not be as strong. I'm going to give you a sample here of kind of what the 14670 sounds like around that time where it's a couple hours before sunset, and it kind of starts to come in here. This is from the 18th of July on 14670.
Okay, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 14670, 1
Canada, UTC, 22 hours, 52 minutes.
22 heures, 52 minutes.
So that's kind of what CHU kind of sounds like here. I don't have any recordings of CFRX, although I've heard them a couple times, and I have a QSL from them. They're a lot more difficult to hear. They kind of poke through ever so slightly on 6070. But that's really what I've heard from Canada. I started shortwave around when CFVP was still on the air, but I never really heard them. They were too low power for that. And when I could have potentially heard them at night was when Radio Marti was on the air. And speaking of Radio Marti is also a great one. They have basically a 24/7 signal on the air. They're just so strong over here from the site in Greenville. Radio Havana, Cuba often varies in transmissions depending on how good or not they are. And whether they're on the air or not, as I gave in my last guest segment here on VOSR from May 30th or May 28th, I believe that was, for listeners in Europe.
An independence of the young Cuban Republic.
The Royal Palm Tree, National Tree of Cuba.
And that's all the time we have for this first hour here on the Radio Havana, Cuba's English language broadcasting studio. And so stay with us on select frequencies. We'll go right into our second hour.
So yeah, that's about how Radio Havana, Cuba sounds, if they're a good signal, really. Nice strong signals from them usually. And next we pan over to South America. I have kind of a low or a badish noise floor on 60 meters or anything below, so I don't really get a lot of those tropical stations. I've heard, although I don't have any really good recordings of the various stations, I've heard Radio Voz Missionaria, Radio Brazil Central 11815, potentially if they're still around, I can't remember. That was a catch from a while ago. And of course, Radio Nacional Amazonia is really the best signal I hear from South America on a daily basis. Great signals starting in around in the winter time. They can be heard around 2300 UTC. That will be 4 p.m. here in my local time area. And in the summer around, I'd say, the same time, 23 UTC, just at 5 p.m. this time. And they go great until sign on around 02, or sign off around 02 UTC on winter time. It depends on 11780 if they're fluttery or not. 6180 usually being better, just depending on the signal and stuff. Summer usually 11780 is better, and 6180 is probably like a very late time catch for me because the sun is out much longer. But if I stay up really late, I can catch them sign on in the mornings. I have a recording from around 0750 UTC sign on. I caught the English service. Pretty good signal, I'd say, on 6180 if I stay up late enough to hear them sign on for the day, and you can hear them for a bit until they fade out as the sun and the day starts in South America, in the Brazil area. Once the sun is up, those frequencies don't really propagate much. But in the evenings, yeah, it varies. It can sound anything like this. So that's how they kind of sound around during the summer midday, long days kind of deal. Depending, they can sound even stronger. I've heard them stronger. And on most times when 6180 comes in, if it's a good day, usually 11780 will be much more fluttery, but this is kind of how 6180 will sound during those kinds of days. And so that's how they kind of sound on on 6180, usually with, of course, interference from XEPPM, Radio Educación on 6185 from Mexico City in Mexico. Let's move on to Africa. Of course, not many stations in Africa are around. I've heard a couple of them, but I don't have any really good recordings. I think I have somewhere a recording right before the transmitting stations in Algeria, well, right before they had swapped to Ifriqiya FM, and it's very heavily Middle Eastern music that they were playing, very fluttery signal. I've heard the VOA transmitter in Botswana, really only the high-powered transmitters, Transworld Radio Africa, really only the small domestic station that I've heard with a good signal, despite some of the Ethiopian stations with very small carriers, is Radio Mali, and I think the best I've ever heard them was on the 18th of September, and this is what they sounded like that day. And that was on 5995 megahertz, by the way. Now, Europe is very interesting. Depending on what station I hear, Europe has always kind of fascinated me, despite the little amount of stations that are left. The BBC World Service is kind of a difficult one to hear now. I can hear the 12095 broadcast at 05 from Madagascar, which we should probably pan over to Madagascar, actually, now that I talk about it, because that is the furthest transmitting station I've heard around. Usually I hear a lot of good transmissions from the former Radio Netherlands relay station and the World Christian Broadcasting station in Madagascar.
1370 and 1200 UTC. You can also look us at the frequency of 118.5.
That was African Pathways Radio from the Madagascar World Voice transmitter owned by World Christian Broadcasting. Going back to the BBC World Service, I don't really listen to them often. Just really depends on the signal, but they don't really have good signals here, except for those couple broadcasts that involve staying up really late, and signals vary. I just like to catch the interval signals, I'd say, except for some special times when they use the right transmitter, like Wooferton per se. In a high frequency like this, I like to listen to the Saturday sports commentaries on shortwave.
They are leading here against Salford City, but it has been frustrating at times. Close enough on the halfway line.
Wales is still there now. They're just probing, having a look.
Make the pass. Roger there, diagonal, no goal.
It's just safe, isn't it?
McCady now cutting back in.
So those are often fun to listen to, especially on that higher frequency 21630. It just really carries it over here into Colorado. Occasionally hear some of the stations from Germany. Like whether it's the Now One transmitter, whenever somebody leases that, or I've heard Channel 292 once. I'd say oftentimes I usually hear, again, more of the high-powered broadcasters. Vatican Radio, I don't often hear English from them, but I hear them quite nice. Used to hear them quite nice on around 01 to 02 UTC, the Spanish and Portuguese broadcast to South America when they're from Greenville. But now, since they're from the Vatican State transmitter, I can still hear those pretty well with the interval signal. I've only caught in English once, but then the signal got very weak, and this is how it sounded on that day. That was February 7th on 15565.
Let's just take African service on Vatican Radio.
It's pretty good signals there. Next, we're going to pan over to Radio Exterior de España. Always great signals, I'd say. Not really much in the winter time, I'd say, when they used the lower frequency for North America 9690, but in the summer when they used to use 17855 and now 15500, really great signal. Although I'd say when they start sign on the weekdays at 1800, the South American frequency 17715 actually comes in better, and then later in the evening 15500, the North American frequency will come in much stronger until sign off. They're like really crystal clear.
Información en la página de Radio Exterior en la web de rtv.es. Radio Exterior de España.
That's how they sound around sign-off time at around 0200 UTC, at least. 0200 is the weekday sign-off time. Next, we're going to pan over to Radio Romania International. Again, they were one of my favorites. Kind of hard to hear now. The West Coast North America broadcast doesn't really come in well anymore. I could try the 11620, although I'd have to go outside for a lower noise floor kind of deal, because they're much weaker in general. I can hear the Romanian broadcast with a pretty good signal, which they're actually, basically some of those Romanian relays are Radio Romania Actualitate, and I will put a recording in here right now of those time pips in the top of the hour identification for that. And next we're going to go back to Radio Romania International. Depending on how their signal is, it always has this characteristic fluttery sound. Let me give you a sample of how that sounds. Okay, that wasn't too bad, but this...
Living Romania. This is Bucharest, Radio Romania International. DX Mailback.
Next, let's go over to Turkey and Voice of Turkey. I personally like to enjoy, whenever I can hear them, listeners in the west coast of North America. You guys are lucky, because I don't often get a really good signal of them, especially in the wintertime when they use the 2200 UTC frequency 5960. Forget it, it's not going to come in at that time. 2200 UTC, it's just no. Or 23 UTC specifically, but 22 UTC in summer 11785 can depend on how good it comes in, but when it usually comes in, it's a little fluttery. And the 02 to 03 or 03 to 04 broadcasts also are just not as good as the 11785, but yeah, 11785 usually really fluttery when it comes in, but it's traveling a lot farther than listeners in the East Coast who get Radio Romania and Voice of Turkey, usually with a lot less flutter than I do.
Wherever you are in the wide world of ours, this is Jen, and I'm coming to you from the sparkling magic of Fourth Wave Radio, and welcome back to another edition of the Littlebox program.
So yeah, that's how Voice of Turkey usually sounds. Next, we're going to go a little more over to India, because I don't really get a lot of stations from the Middle East, or I don't even think I've heard any except of the radio station that was Republic of Yemen Radio, which with that iconic buzz. I actually have a recording of that. Let me pull that out for us. Kind of weak there, but that's how they sounded on 11930 here. Especially during the winter time, they were a little bit stronger. But back to India, really the only time I've actually ever heard Akashvani was this last season, the B25 schedule season. Akashvani had used 11900 around the 16 UTC, 1730 UTC, that area block, instead of 9620. And I was actually able to catch the interval signal quite a couple times. Fluttery, of course, but that's because it's really going over the North Pole to get over here into Colorado. But that was the first time I caught the interval signal direct from India. It's a pretty interesting recording there. I'm really happy to catch that one. And as we get closer to Asia and stuff, we get to a lot more of the active stations. At least a lot of the stations in Asia are still active. Next, we're going to move to China. I'm just going to play a quick snippet. I don't really have any good recordings of the China Radio International theme, except for one in Japanese. And listeners in Europe and other places would be surprised that China Radio International in English is actually kind of hard to get here. We don't get it often. I can oftentimes get 15590 beamed to Europe from Urumqi, and occasionally in the evenings from the Kashisaiba transmitter. But other than that, it's kind of difficult to hear. They do have frequencies to North America. Those come from Cuba, and we know the situation with Cuba in transmissions currently is not the best.
CGT. Radio. Here is
That's actually a rare time we get it during the winter gray line that we get for Asia around our evenings here, around 2300 UTC, 2200 UTC, and 0 hours UTC, where that will come in sometimes on 11790 CRI in English from one of the transmitting stations, Beam 2 Southeast Asia. Usually gets a pretty good signal, but that's only during the winter time when we get that special gray line. Next, we're going to play you KBS World Radio, which is very, listeners in North America know 15575 is really only a summer frequency, and it's all right. Some days it comes in really nice, and some days it doesn't come in really nice. But when it does come in really nice, it sounds pretty good, like this.
World Radio coming from Seoul, the Republic of Korea.
여기는 대한민국 서울에서 보내드리는 KBS 월드 라디오입니다.
This is KBS World Radio coming from Seoul, the Republic of Korea.
여기는 대한민국 서울에서 보내드리는 KBS 월드 라디오입니다.
Next, we have Voice of Korea from North Korea. They have two transmissions on the air to North America, or two frequencies on the air. In English, 13 to 14 UTC and 15 to 16 UTC on 9435 and 11710. And usually one day, 9435 or 11710. It's usually better, and then next day could be flip-flop. Some days they don't come in. It all really depends.
Now, we start English language service of Voice of Korea from Pyongyang, the capital of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Next is the Voice of Mongolia. I like to catch this one a lot. Very rare catch here. One time I did, thank goodness, catch them. It was, again, very weak, but I was happy to catch them here. And that was on 12015 kilohertz. Next, we're going to do Voice of Vietnam. I don't really have any good recordings of them, but I can kind of hear them depending if it's good on 12020 around the mornings, 1300 UTC kind of broadcast area. And then we're going to pan over to the Philippines for FEBC. I can hear the Voice of America transmitter from Tinang, depending on if it comes in really good. But FEBC is kind of an interesting one here, and this is one that I actually caught from that same gray line that I had with CRI in English. Next, we're going to do Radio Taiwan. I don't really have any good example of how they sound, but Radio Taiwan usually can come in pretty well in the mornings. Nothing really in English. That one English broadcast they have doesn't propagate over here into North America, at least Colorado area. But I can often hear a lot of the clandestine stations from Japan to North Korea, from Taiwan, or any other transmission beamed up north like that can just come over the pole, and it works really well. Next, NHK Radio Japan. I often hear them a lot from Yamata, especially the English service when it was on 11815 and now kind of on 11800. Here's how they sound, though, when we get that gray line again in our winter time. The Japanese broadcast, usually in the lower 25-meter bands. It's been 11630 for the past couple of years for me, and it usually sounds like this.
時刻は7時39分になるところです。ここで音楽です。ベースボールベアで
A Happy New Year.
And then here's a catch of them I caught right at the end of the sign-off of the English service, and then sign-on in Japanese, or sign-on in Burmese time period where they play that interval signal. During the summertime, now not longer because they're on 11800, but when they were on 11815, this was best during the summer, because in the winter it would be weaker and suffer interference from China Radio International, who still uses that same frequency at the same time in English, both in the winter and in the summertime.
That wraps up this edition of NHK News One. I'm Roger Potter in Tokyo. There's much more to come on NHK World Japan, so please.
This is NHK World, Radio Japan, Tokyo.
I know I haven't really covered all the stations, and there are a lot more that I've probably skipped over and stuff, but two other big highlights that I want to do. Reach Beyond Australia, I can hear them a couple times in our mornings, or any time in our mornings. Usually that's around the window of 1100 to 1500 UTC is the best to hear a lot of signals from Asia and the Pacific area, and that's usually one like this.
Thank you for tuning to Reach Beyond Australia. Join us again tomorrow evening at 12:30 UTC or 6 p.m. India Standard Time on the same frequency of 11900 kilohertz in the 25-meter band.
And then finally we're going to end it off with Radio New Zealand. Good signals always in the summer. I can hear them early for us around 2200 UTC. That could be around 3 or 4 p.m. here local. And they'll start coming in on 17675 all the way up until our early mornings. If not, because in the wintertime that doesn't really work, I can hear them much later in the day, or have them kind of sign on. I usually call it a sign-on, although it's not really, because they have one transmission beam to the Pacific, and then right when I would tune in, which would be around 6 a.m. during our winter times, they'd sign on. That's 13 UTC. They'd swap over to their Pacific antenna beam at 35 degrees, and it just has a great clear signal like this.
RNZ News at 2. Morena, good morning. I'm Vicky Mackay. A budgeting service provider in Auckland says the government...
And that's kind of my recording-oriented based broadcast here, or segment here on what I can hear, at least in Colorado. Just a couple of highlights and some of these recordings to give you an idea of kind of what I hear and how they come into the Colorado, over here in Colorado. Alright, it is time for the mailbag show. Everybody loves a good mailbag show. I do, of course, and VOSR's mailbag show is no exception. So we're going to read a couple of emails that Jeff had sent me from listeners, and we're going to read these out on the air, as every mailbag program should. And if you would like to send me a reception report, how is the signal? Where are you listening from? And did you enjoy the broadcast? Well, you can do so here. Get your email address ready, or get a pen and paper ready, because I'm going to give you the email address, or get your email ready for the email address, which I will give to you very shortly here. We have only a couple of emails to work with this week. We've got 3, so we will give those to you. But first, those email addresses for you. So if you want to send me your reception report or how well the signal is coming in your area, you can do so here at LSPENCER LS3141 at gmail.com. That is LSPENCER3141 at gmail.com. And if you want to send your reception report or your thoughts on the program to Jeff, you can always, of course, do that. That is VOSRINT at yahoo.com. That's VOSRINT at yahoo.com. And there's also a contact button at the VOSR website, VOSRinternational.com. And that's another way you can contact Jeff. So those are the two emails, whether you want to send your reports or thoughts to me or to Jeff or both, it doesn't matter. But let's dive into the mailbag. Alright, first report we got here is from Logan Pine. He listened to the May 30th program on 9455 from WRMI. He says, static in the signal, but easily audible. Minor background interference via another program. VOSR show started at 10 p.m. Central Standard Time, beginning with an intro. This is followed by a guest speaking on Radio Havana, Cuba. That's yours truly. And he says, hello, I'm listening in on my personal RTL SDR V4 via SDR Sharp software in Melrose Park, Illinois, west of Chicago. I usually only use it for FM listening while I work or as a local railroad scanner. I recently dug out a handheld CB and was testing its operation with the SDR. Afterwards, I was just scrolling around and stumbled onto the start of the VOSR show. I'm not sure about the details of my antenna setup. My grandfather was a ham operator and had a mast set up outside. I just hooked his old coax into my SDR device. Seems to work really well. Best wishes, LP. And thank you, Logan, for tuning into VOSR. It's always great to hear from listeners. I like to listen to various radio stations in Chicago myself, but it seems like you got quite a good setup there. Nice SDR there. I've wanted an SDR myself, but seems the signal is very good there for you on 9455. It usually is for a lot of people here if you're in the western-ish, like mid North America, or middle of the U.S. or west of the U.S. and Canada. Seems to be better in that direction. And next up we got a email from Eric Cooper. He says, hi Jeff and Liam. Hey, that's me. Just wanted to briefly mention that the very first shortwave signal and station that I ever heard in 1964 was Radio Havana, Cuba, which was, I believe, about 2 years after they began. A great show. 73 Eric Cooper. Says he's listening temporarily via a QSDR in California. And thank you, Eric, for tuning in. Sounds like you enjoyed the program and my guest segment on Radio Havana, Cuba. I appreciate your feedback on that. You've certainly been listening to Radio Havana, Cuba for a long time. That's amazing. I'm sure their programming has changed over the years from Cold War propaganda to now most of their programming is kind of like most other shortwave radio stations that at least dedicate their programs to a shortwave audience, where just tell about the country that you're listening to. So in this case, they're telling the world about Cuba. And next we have an email from Jeff in Virginia, and thank you so much for writing in, of course, and here is his message. This is Jeff from Virginia. Thank you for sharing your vacation with your listeners, and thank you, Liam and Greg, for your segments. I enjoyed the show. This week, May 30th, 2026, I tried something different and recorded your shows on a SDR Play RS DX-R2 using a K480 loop antenna. The broadcast on 9455 at UTC 0300 was best. A little fading and static, but still good listening. The 5850 broadcast was about the same, a little bit more static and fading, but good listening as well. The 15770 broadcast started with lots of static and noise. Then the signal could not be heard from 5 minutes until about 30 minutes into the show. After that, the signal slowly improved, and the last 15 minutes was quite good. I tried to listen to last week's broadcast, May 23rd, 2026, but there was bad weather in our area that weekend, which made that impossible. Thank you for providing recordings online of the broadcast for those times. Hopes this helps, and looking forward to the next broadcast. And hey, Jeff, thank you for your message. It's really great to hear from you. Again, thank you very much for writing in, and I'm sure Jeff appreciates you writing in. You know, it's always great to write into a station, let them know where you're listening from. And again, you can do that here. Just send an email to me or Jeff. Thank you for the in-depth report on the 3 WRMI transmission frequencies. It's kind of about the same for me. I've never checked the 15770 broadcast myself, but the 5850 was pretty good for a long time there. And now it's kind of starting to get a little weak at the beginning of the program, but later on as the days get longer over here in the northern hemisphere with summertime, so 5850 just doesn't really work. But 9455 is really great, nice and strong over here, at least in Colorado. I'd give it all 5 in a Simpo, but unfortunately I got some nasty 60 hertz noise under that, some local RFI that hurts it, but 9455 is still strong. It's just amazing signal there. And it seems like you got some good recordings there using the SDR Play RS DXR2 and the K480 loop. I do record a couple of the shows myself, although I do it quite differently. I use cassette tapes. So very different setup there. But it seems like you got a good signal there, and hopefully got a good recording. And thank you very much for writing in. And that's all the 3 letters we have in the mailbag this week. If you want to send me your thoughts on the program or anything like that, you can contact me via the email address that is LSPENCER3141 at gmail.com. Again, that is LSPENCER3141 at gmail.com. And if you want to send your thoughts or reception reports to Jeff as well, you can do so at VOSRINT at yahoo.com. That is VOSRINT at yahoo.com. And so we're just about to the end of the program. Thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in. Once again, I am Liam, hosting for Jeff this week here in Berthoud, Colorado, in the USA. And you can find me on my YouTube channel. That is the @ symbol, the Shortwave Archive 35. So just type that into the search bar there. The @ symbol, like you're writing an email address at yahoo.com or at gmail.com. That @ symbol, the Shortwave Archive 35. And you should get me. That's really the only social I'm active on. And once again, thank you very much, Jeff, for letting me host this broadcast. Took a lot of coordination, about 3 weeks, but it went very smoothly, and just thank you once again. And you should hear from Jeff next week on the show. And without further ado, from Berthoud, Colorado, I say good night, good luck, 73s, and good DX.
And that concludes our broadcast. Be sure to catch our broadcasts every Saturday at 0300 UTC on 9455 kHz, and also on Saturdays at 2300 UTC on 15770 kHz, transmitted by WRMI Radio Miami International from Okeechobee, Florida.
We are also broadcast by Shortwave Radio Gold in Lower Saxony, Germany
on Thursdays at 1800 UTC on both 3975 kilohertz and 6160 kilohertz.